Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So if you've been watching my YouTube channel over the past many months, you know that I've done quite a few videos looking at the Beat Generation and counterculture during the 1950s, but I'm about to read a couple books looking at the 1960s, do a couple videos analyzing 1960s counterculture. But before I do that, I wanted to refresh myself a little more on 1950s and post-war America. Not looking at counterculture, just looking at America as a whole during the 1950s. So I wanted to read a book that looked at particularly at 1950s America. So the book I decided to read was Consumer's Republic, which is a book that I had read in college about 10 years ago. So it's been quite a while. So reading it this time was pretty much reading it brand new. But I feel like this book does a really good job looking at 1950s and post-war America. And this book is very, very dense. It's not a very riveting read. It's not a very exciting read, but there's a ton of facts and statistics, and it really gives you a good understanding of consumerism in 1950s America. So it was a really good book to really get a foundation of what was happening in America after World War II. So, like I said, I'm not going to look at every single thing in this book. I'm just going to kind of pull out the main things that really relate to what I'm going to be looking at when I look at the 1960s, just kind of looking at how the 50s set up the 1960s, and it was really the origin of a lot of things that happened during the 1960s. But in the beginning of this book, I really liked how it looks at how the origins of consumerism are really in the New Deal. When you think of the 1950s idea of a prosperous economy, everything was happening culturally in the 1950s, that really has its origin in the New Deal. Because the New Deal was a way to kind of re-engineer the economy of America during the Great Depression through things like price controls and a planned economy, and just really changing the way the economy worked in America. And World War II really saw the fulfillment of all those ideals, the way that the economy was really planned during World War II for the government to step in and tell companies what they're going to produce, what they're not going to produce, and just really cause America to just kind of, the whole society was just completely rewriting itself to win World War II. And World War II itself allowed America to really invest in itself through things like war bonds, and just the way that the home front just caused a fully mobilized society. And World War II was a foreign war, but the way that the home front was mobilized, it really was a domestic war as well, in the way that it just completely restructured society while this war was going on. And the way that the whole society was reformed during World War II just allowed the fulfillment of all of the New Deal ideals, and just set up America to have a really prosperous post-World War II era. And getting into some other things that this book talks about, this book looks a lot at race in the 1950s, and it talks about how prior to the Great Depression, African Americans in America really had their own separate economy that was separate from the white economy in America. And they had a lot of their own businesses, and they were just very separate. They weren't very intertwined with white America. But World War II really started to change that cycle, to change the way that worked. Because during World War II, the military and the home front became very integrated, and that started to bring a lot of African Americans into the white economy. And you saw a lot of integration slowly begin to happen. But despite that integration, despite the way that the military was desegregated and a lot of black people came into new areas of the country to work during World War II, the GI Bill of Rights, which benefited a lot of soldiers after World War II, really wasn't realized for a lot of black GIs. They really didn't get this benefit that all the white GIs has, because the country really wasn't opened up. It was still very segregated, so they didn't have access to a lot of things that white people were able to access after World War II to improve their lives and really kickstart this period of economic prosperity in the 1950s. But you see that African Americans were systematically left out of a lot of these benefits. A lot of housing was not open to African Americans. There's the idea of redlining, where certain areas they weren't able to give mortgages to certain people in certain areas. So black people were kept out of a lot of nicer areas in major cities, especially places like Philadelphia and New York City. And after World War II, there were a lot of new housing developments that were built all throughout the United States. And one example is Levittown in Long Island, New York. And Levittown, when it was opened, allowed 70,000 people to move into that community. And of those 70,000 people, they were all white. It was only open to white people when people moved into Levittown, New York. So it's just insane to think that they had all this housing built, but it was excluded, or was just for white people. So you can see how Black people were really systematically left out of this prosperous 1950s time period. And this book talks about how by the year 1980 in Levittown, New York, there was only 45 Black residents and 446 people of other races, so other minorities that were not Black people. So when Levittown first opened in, I believe it was 52 or 53, up until 1980, there's really no change at all with who was living in this area. It was still pretty much only white people who lived in Levittown. So you can see that the effects of all the segregation and redlining during the 1950s still lived on for a very long time. Even today, there's still effects of what happened back then. So you really see how Black people were systematically left out of this society, this economy of 1950s, and the effects of that still live on today. So when people talk today about reparations and trying to find ways to fix what was done, we're not talking about fixing things that happened when slaves were freed back in the 1800s. We're talking about things that happened very recently. The way that Black people are systematically left out of our society, left out of the economy, that's what we're talking about. Things that happened decades ago. And I feel like if you systematically leave people out of the system, you have to systematically bring people back in. So I think when people talk about reparations, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about just fixing all of these things that happened very recently. These aren't old things. These are things that are, even today, we're still seeing the effects of that. So I think that what this book is really showing, or what I took away from this, is that you see how the 1950s really set up the civil rights movement that you saw begin to take root in the mid-50s and really took off in the early 1960s. So you see how the way that Black people were just kept out of society and were just segregated from this prosperous time period, you see how that just established how it was going to just make people want to change that and find ways to change that. And that's where I think the civil rights movement really had its roots in the way that African Americans were treated after World War II. And as this book looks at the origins of consumerism and the development of suburbia in post-World War II America, it really uses New Jersey as its case study. New Jersey is really the best example to look at how suburbia and consumerism developed. And I live in New Jersey, so it's very interesting to me to read about how New Jersey was so central in this consumeristic culture that developed after World War II. And New Jersey is really the perfect place for that to happen, because New Jersey is located between Philadelphia and New York City. And New Jersey is one of the few states where the major metropolitan areas in New Jersey are not actually located in New Jersey. Philadelphia and New York are the major cities that New Jersey is located in between. So the suburbs develop in between those two major cities. And with the development of the interstate system in the late 1950s, it really allowed people to move very freely and very quickly between these two major cities and throughout New Jersey. So the suburbs developed right in between these two major cities, right where the interstate came through. Suburbs really came up all around the area, and shopping malls are very common throughout New Jersey. And it was just this perfect system of people living and spending money in New Jersey and then working in the major cities of New York and Philadelphia. So New Jersey was just set up to become the epicenter of consumerism and the development of suburbia in post-World War II America. So as people lived in the suburbs and just lived in this environment of consumerism became this culture. And the idea of buying and spending money became almost this patriotic thing where being a citizen was seen as being a consumer, being someone who buys into consumerism, buys into buying products and just being someone who spends money. That's what really 1950s was about. It was about buying new things and being a conformist in a way that you bought everything else that everyone else bought. Everyone was buying the same things. And I think this book doesn't talk about it too much, but it talks about it a little bit. But I think that a lot of consumeristic culture had a lot to do with the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, America really saw itself as, capitalism against communism, and the ability to spend and buy new things was really, I think, the epitome of what people saw as capitalism. So I think a lot of this consumeristic culture was pushed on people just to, prove to the Soviets that, we had this prosperous economy where people could buy all these cool things that they couldn't buy in the Soviet Union. And as this consumeristic culture starts to develop, you start to see marketing really kick into full gear. All these ideas of, like 9 out of 10 people love this product, or you must have this product. All these marketing phrases and terms that you hear really have their root in 1950s, in this origins of consumerism. And as people were buying televisions and radios, you started to see advertisements for products on TV and radio, and just this full consumeristic culture just it developed in America during this time period. And this book talks a little bit about the idea of planned obsolescence, where things are engineered to last only for a certain amount of times. People need to buy something new. So like toasters are made to last for, let's just say 10 years, and then you have to buy a new one. And it just creates this culture of constantly buying the latest and greatest product. And we're still very much living in that culture today. We're very much living in consumerism even today. And this book talks about a lot of the negative effects of consumerism, the way that certain products were advertised for certain groups of people. You see that a lot in a lot of products for housework were marketed towards women. So women were expected to be seen as using certain products around the house. So just kind of perpetuated this idea of 1950s housewife, which is very harmful to women back then, and you still see ill effects of that today. So you see how consumerism isn't all good things. There's a lot of negative effects that come along with consumerism. And during the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy had this idea of the Consumer Bill of Rights. So he was really trying to create an environment where consumers couldn't really be taken as advantage of from companies as they are. Obviously, people today are still very much taken advantage of by companies, but you started to see this mindset of wanting to change this system beginning to take root as the post-war time period went on, and saw a lot more, I think, change during the 1960s. But this book primarily looks at 1950s when it looks at what was happening with consumerism. I think the main thing I took away from this book is that 1950s were a time period of extreme economic growth, but also a time period of extreme inequality. So it's kind of this duality between a lot of really good things, but a lot of really bad things happening at the very same time. And that really, I think, that duality of economic growth and inequality, I think, set the stage for the 1960s. It sets the stage for the counterculture movement, because people really began to see that there was all this inequality in America, despite all of this economic growth. And a lot of the people who were part of the counterculture in the 60s, a lot of the hippies were very well-educated people. And that education came from this period of economic growth. All this economic growth allowed people to be able to afford to go to college and get a decent education. And because people were so well-educated, they were very aware of what was happening in America, very aware of this inequality. And a lot of people who weren't very well-educated were the ones who were minorities and the ones who weren't given all this potential for economic growth and mobility. So it really just set the stage for, I think, things to really explode during the 1960s. And even in the 1950s, you saw the National Defense Education Act, which began after Sputnik. They really pushed for a lot of science and math education, and they just pushed for Americans to become more well-educated. And I think the ultimate effect of that was the counterculture movement. You had people who were educated that saw what was happening. They understood all the inequality that was in this country. And I think a lot of the prosperity of the 1950s, the system that allowed the 50s to be so prosperous, that same system is creating a lot of problems today. Because the idea of consumerism is also very rooted in the idea of making money. All these businesses want to make money. And today you have a lot of inequality, unstable work, unaffordable housing, because that's all very profitable. It's very profitable for people to not be able to afford buying a house, not be able to afford things. It allows companies, I think, to really take advantage of people today. So I think this concept of consumerism, it was very beneficial in the 1950s, and there were a lot of benefits to it. Obviously, people were kept out of those benefits, and not everyone was allowed to, take part in those benefits. But I think those benefits back then really, I think over time, created more problems for equality in America that you're seeing effects of that today. And I think also, this book doesn't talk about it, but I think the end of the Cold War really contributed a lot to rising inequality today, because during the Cold War, there was a reason to want to protect workers, protect consumers, because they were trying to prove to the Soviets that America was this really prosperous system where people could really move up and people could make money and buy things and just be the ultimate capitalist society. And when there's no longer a reason to prove that to anyone, I think you start to see the government and companies starting to take advantage of people a lot more than they did before, prior to the 1980s. And one last reflection I wanted to share that I had after reading this book is that I find it very interesting that when you look at the 1950s, look at this era of economic prosperity, a lot of that time period was in many ways fulfillment of the ideals of the progressive era during the early 20th century. And this is kind of getting into the whole 80-year cycle of history, but the high period at the start of every cycle is usually a fulfillment of the ideals during the awakening of the previous cycle. And for the 1950s, that was the progressive era. But looking at today, America is currently going through a crisis period. And once we make it through this crisis, if we make it through this crisis, there will inevitably be a period of economic prosperity where there's a lot of economic growth, a lot of stability. And that era will likely have a fulfillment of the ideals of the previous cycle's awakening, which in our case was 1960s. A lot of these ideals in the 1960s, which began to be realized, materialized in the 1960s, lost a lot of steam. And the high period next cycle will likely pick up where a lot of those ideals left off. Because if you look at the previous crisis during the Great Depression, if you told someone then that there was going to be this period of economic prosperity in the 50s, they probably wouldn't believe you. And it's probably the case for today, because every crisis comes to an end. After the crisis, there is always a period of stability. So we will likely see another 1950s-like environment. They're saying that the cycle we're in now, this crisis period, could end in the early 2030s. So the late 2030s, early 2040s could be the next 1950s, could be this next high period after a crisis. But who knows? It's just speculation. It's just a theory about how history goes in cycles. So it's impossible to predict if that's going to be the case. But just a thought that I had after reading this, how history likely goes in cycles, and if it does, we may see another era like this, and who knows what that will look like, what that will be like with the rise of artificial intelligence. Who knows how that's going to influence our economy? So we're going through a period of profound change. For better or worse, Donald Trump is really upending the system that we have in this country in a very similar way that FDR did, and to an extent Lincoln did during the Civil War. And who knows what will come out of this? I mean, I don't agree with anything Trump is doing, but it definitely, I think, reflects this era of upheaval that we've seen again and again throughout American history every 80 years. And I think it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. But yeah, I just had some thoughts about that after reading this book. But anyway, this is a great book. It definitely led to a lot of interesting reflections on 1950s, the post-World War II era. I definitely would recommend it, but it's not a very exciting book. If you're looking for a very exciting book, this is definitely not the book you want to read. This book has a lot of facts and statistics and just a lot of just information laid out, not a very strong narrative at all. I mean, it's a history book, so you can't expect too much, but it's a little dry. There's not a very exciting book to read, but it definitely gives you a full picture of what was happening during the 1950s in this post-war era. It really gives you a full understanding of the origins of consumerism, and just, I think, I took a lot away from this book. There's a lot of information here that really expanded my knowledge of the post-war era. But anyway, that's Consumers Republic by Lizabeth Cohen. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.